Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Gary, it is a pleasure to have you back on the show. I feel like I got to find another interest of yours at some point because every time you're on, we're always talking about the JFK assassination, but it does take up a lot of people's time. I mean, for me, it's completely absorbed me for the past 2 years.
Well, it's fun for me to go back since most of my involvement was a long, long time ago. And it happened a long time ago, and it's easy to forget that. But we thought of Kennedy as a young president, a young man, when he was born 1915. Kennedy would be over 100 today. But in my mind, he's still that young guy.
Can you believe it's about to be 60 years coming up?
It's mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling.
Do you think
I've had
there's going
an
to be ever?
entire career since, because my career as a psychologist started a couple of years afterwards, and my entire career well, it's still going, but it has happened during this time interval.
Do you expect any changes coming up with the 60th anniversary? Obviously, you see a little bit of interest here and there, but I think that happens almost every anniversary. I'm just wondering if we're actually going to see. I think if you search it up now, you'll see more articles about the conspiracy stuff than you do about the official theory, which is interesting.
Oh, I agree. And in fact, I think the average person has really no knowledge or memory of any of the specifics. So when people like us get into the details and say, wow, look at this, uh, people don't recall the whole picture. They have a vague notion. There was this guy, Lee Harvey Oswald, and there was controversy about, and many times people think the controversy was whether he had help. The whole bunch of cover-up stuff did have to do with possible conspiracies, but those involving Oswald, the theory that there was somebody else involved. But yeah, I don't expect to see anything, to tell you the truth, except the usual flurry of activities with some critics writing things. And there's always a bunch of pro-commission stuff that comes out about this time, which has a much better chance of flying because conspiracy theories now have an evil tone to them, a negative tone. Unfortunately, everything gets lumped together. Whether, whether or not there is any kind of factual basis. So certainly the JFK assassination work, for the large part, was focused on the facts and the details and what was possible and what was impossible, not theorizing widely exactly how it happened. It gets contaminated by people saying it was LBJ or it was this or that person. And it's easy to get lost in the fact that the Warren Commission report is just plain wrong. It's not even close. And the reality is the story is very different from that. And obviously, this was a professional job done by skilled marksmen with a well-planned thing. A crappy job on framing Oswald. The weird thing is that it was enough to fly. But I think the secret to the whole thing was, in fact, the Cold War and immense fears. You have one group fearing it would be linked to the Soviet Union or Cuba, and we'd start a third world war. Both sides of the political aisle worried it would be put at their doorstep. You could link Oswald to almost anything. Pro-Castro, anti-Castro, and I think everybody ran for cover. And most of all, there was one agreement, is that this thing needed to be cleaned up. It needed to be smoothed over, and the country needed to not pay attention to it. That was the bottom line. By the way, something long forgotten is Ed Epstein's statement that the Warren Commission found the political truth. That phrase is long forgotten, and Ed Epstein's long forgotten, but that was one thing he was clearly right about. The political truth meant something that was saleable, something that would calm the waters, period. It wasn't about an explanation. It was about an end to controversy.
Do you think that the Warren Commission was wrong in their investigation, or do you think that the message just got relayed differently? When I say that is, people think the Warren Commission was an investigation into the president's death. Based on the National Archives and everything that they have listed for the Warren Commission, the summary of their conclusions was Lee Harvey Oswald being the assassin, and their evidence supports that they only looked at that angle. They never bothered to actually investigate the possibility of conspiracy or actually investigate the president's death. And I think a lot of people just get it mixed up. They go, oh, yeah, the Warren Commission's that investigation into the president's death. It's like, well, no, it was just Lee Harvey Oswald. We need you to work within these parameters. And there you go. And they did their job that way.
Well, just remember that most of the members of the commission did not want to serve, had to be dragged into it because it was going to be some kind of political reckoning. It wasn't going to be an investigation. Remember that the FBI was charged with the investigation. The commission was a group of mostly young lawyers who were running down different leads, trying to clean up different areas. But you're absolutely right. They did not investigate seriously the possibility that there was any other story other than this lone guy. I might add that remember that Richard Russell at first wouldn't sign the report, and that members of the commission balked at the idea that the commission had ruled out a conspiracy. That was one of the sticking points. And of course, we know several of the commissioners didn't buy the single bullet theory. And just to remind ourselves that J. Lee Rankin, senior counsel, said that to say that the single bullet theory is not correct is to say there were at least two assassins. He said point blank, without that, if you don't buy that theory, it's not possible for one lone person from the rear to have done all the shots, period. Not possible. And I think that's the crazy part about this case. There is a series of impossibilities or extreme unlikely things that are somehow passed off as an explanation. You know, by the way, looking at the stuff that's coming out now, you have a Secret Service agent suddenly saying that he found bullet 399, Commission Exhibit 399, the magic bullet, in the limousine and put it on the stretcher, beyond the fact that that's totally bizarre idea that he would do that. We have a couple of problems with that, not the least of which is that many, many years ago, when asked about it, he has never claimed that. He has said there was a bullet fragment. Big difference, because the magic bullet is the only thing that ties that rifle to the killing of the president. Without bullet 399, they have no ballistic matches. That was a key shot. The question is, did it hit anything in that car? Remember, it was found at the Parkland Hospital, not on a stretcher. It was on the floor. The closest stretchers to it had nothing to do with the case, and there's no evidence that the president or the governor's stretcher were nearby. Then we have the weird situation of the FBI believing that it must have been dropped off the president's stretcher, simply because when their agents attended the autopsy, Seibert and O'Neill, who took notes, said that there was a bullet that apparently hit the back, didn't go anywhere, but wasn't in the body. Now they were going to dissect. When Lieutenant Colonel Fink was brought on board, the only qualified man to be present, he said, we've got to dissect the wounds to get the autopsy started, and he was ordered not to do any of that. But that was the belief. Then Ruby shoots Oswald. Sunday morning, we have a new version of the autopsy report, and now they're positing that it was in Conley's leg. How it would have got out of the leg's unclear, but you have metal through Conley's body and 7 wounds. How is that possible? Or 5 wounds in Conley.
Was that the big breaking point for you, was the single bullet theory? Because there's a lot in the case that doesn't make sense. Like for me, I'm looking at the Warren Commission stuff, and there's a lot of evidence that came out against Oswald. Obviously, probably I would say Marina and Ruth Payne were the worst statements that were made against Oswald to really solidify him as the lone assassin in the public's mind. Mostly because everyone's like, oh, his wife is even saying that he was crazy and this lone nut person. And the neighbor that lived with him has all this evidence that starts popping out of her magic garage and everything. But then you look at like the Mourne Shields, who everyone suspects was like watching Oswald as a handler. They were like, Oswald was a good guy. His wife was abusive to him. And I'm like, well, the Warren Commission got that information and they put it in their volumes. And I'm like, and that does not agree with the official lone nut scenario, which makes this Oswald character have like 50,000 different personalities where you don't know. And I just thought in the beginning that they just had a bunch of agencies that were just gathering intel on Oswald to put in this report, and everyone came up with either he was this Russian person or he was this and he was this. And that's why we have these mixed bags. But no, it's like the Warren Commission wanted to make it impossible for you to understand who Oswald really was.
Well, and remember, they didn't push, and of course, some stuff was hidden from them. But remember that most of the information about Oswald around the defection and the issues related to his trip to Mexico and all of that stuff, scant information on it. And interesting enough, the most important things in Oswald's life, like the summer before the assassination, we know very little. The other piece that's interesting is that we can't tie Oswald to any practice with a weapon, nor is there any clear evidence that the weapon was in the garage in the first place. The bottom line was, at some point, a weapon was put there, but we know that Marina thought it was still there when they went out to search the Payne garage, because it was just a blanket on the ground. And they opened it up and there wasn't a rifle in there. But she hadn't looked in there. Ruth Payne hadn't. Nobody claimed they had seen the rifle since Oswald laid it down a long time before.
Do you believe that though? You don't actually believe Ruth Payne or Michael Payne didn't know what was in that blanket. That's so suspicious to me. I think Michael Payne stated he thought it was old camping equipment like he had when he was a kid. I'm like, you're telling me this guy who is living in somebody else's home, who's not even really there, apparently, to Ruth Payne's degree, but you say that he has some old retro camping equipment, the metal kind. You don't know what a rifle looks like?
Well, again, I the only thing I would say is that it clearly, you couldn't clearly tell what it was, in a sense, in that when they went back to the garage, Marina thought whatever was there was still there. And or it wasn't. I don't think you could see a clear outline. But I think all of this stuff, the whole role of the Paynes, de Mernschelt, is all adds to the story. But we don't know precisely who is doing what, except we do know this: there was no evidence Oswald ever practiced with a weapon. There's considerable evidence that someone using the name Oswald went car shopping and went to rifle ranges. It may have been different people, and acted like an ass so that people remembered him, and that somebody was out there shooting. It's just, we know that it wasn't Oswald. So it's one of two things. It's either Oswald or it's a frame. There's not a lot of middle ground there. Oswald is not a name people go throwing around, at least not back then. And certainly going to a rifle range and making an ass of yourself, I'm sure there are people that do that, but not people that do that so you remember who they are. I think the reality is both that and the Chicago plot, which was thwarted, both have people that were ready-made patsies. There may well have been other such plots out there with patsies, but the patsy thing was key. If you don't have somebody to catch, blame it on. But the second piece is that Oswald absolutely had to be killed. Now, I do not believe he was meant to be captured. I believe he was in the Texas theater, was set up to be killed, and I believe it's some kind of a incredible stroke of luck that he wasn't killed. Then they have a problem, because then if he's going to go to trial, what about the autopsy? All of that stuff would not have passed muster. Got to remember, Abraham Lincoln had to be exhumed because of mysteries about his autopsy. In this case, that wouldn't have flown for 10 minutes. And I think the reality, and you can't not have the brain and things like that. If this had been a trial, it would have been explosive. So Ruby had to be, somebody had to kill Oswald. Now, the problem they had was, I believe, with a gun in his hand, a loaded gun in a dark theater, and remember, he wasn't being sought for the murder of the president. At that time, all evidence was he was being sought for the murder of Tippit. And so the question is, was Tippit supposed to kill him? What was that? What was that encounter about? If that was even Oswald. The second thing is the survival in the theater is mind-boggling. In a dark theater, if you're thought to have been the murderer of a police officer with a theater surrounded by cop cars, I mean, what's the chance of living through that encounter? But I think once he was alive, they had a problem. First problem was he had to be cut off from communication. So you have a situation where essentially there is no stenographer present, no lawyer present for all that long period of time when he's interrogated. We have few memories of some things he said, but we don't have a single page of stenographer's notes. The most important prisoner in the century, maybe in history, and we don't know what he said. There's no official transcript. He's questioned without an attorney. And we know that when he got to make his one phone call, it was intercepted by, we still don't know who the agents were who were in the room with the telephone operator, but we do know, we now have clear sources that they made sure that the phone call didn't go through. He was just told it wouldn't go through. And we know who he tried to call. But again, none of that stuff was ever looked into.
A little thing on the theater. Do you believe the intelligence aspect to it, which is where spies meet in movie theaters? Because I know everyone says that's just the Cold War move, but I actually found documentation that states that they even wrote down that from witnesses that were in the theater that Oswald was sitting next to random individuals in the theater, just kept getting up and sitting down to them, which is that he had that box top, which is on the list of items that they did pull off of him when they arrested him. It's a cardboard top, is what it says. And half of it, so that means you would hold it up to someone and match it, and that would be your content. That would make the only sense. I mean, you're not going to go see a movie after allegedly killing a president and then going and killing a cop. It's the weirdest flight pattern that's out there. But a lot of people don't know there was two people arrested in that theater. One was in the balcony and one was on the main floor. Oswald was arrested on the main floor and someone else was arrested in the balcony. And I think there's a guy who saw what he thought was Oswald getting pulled out into the alley in the back. And it wasn't until like 20 years or 30 years later, he actually saw the footage of Oswald being brought out the front. And he didn't know. He thought the guy that he saw, that's how Oswald was arrested for all those years, and then sees the footage of him being dragged out front, and realized that there was a whole other person who, in descriptions from affidavits of Dallas police, said that looked a lot like Oswald. So it could be an accidental thing, but they think that's the guy who didn't pay for the ticket. Because that everyone says Oswald didn't pay for a ticket. He went to a movie theater. So he has money in his pocket because he easily done it.
Well, the weird thing is who's going to a theater in the middle of the afternoon? I mean, it's the whole thing was a weird thing. My assumption, of course, we don't know where precisely Oswald was and when the shots were fired. He was either on the first floor. There is evidence that he told that he said he was on the first floor finishing his lunch, and he went up to the second floor to get a Coke. And there's obviously the version that he was already in the lunchroom and was up there the whole time. But either place, the question at that point is, when something like this happens, given he's an informant of some sort, we don't know what his assignments were. We know he was an informant. That's about it. Does he go and make a phone call and report into somebody and then get told what to do next? Because certainly going to the theater, I think you're quite correct. It has to have been either to meet somebody or simply to follow an instruction to go there. But certainly, I think your hypothesis is a reasonable one, that it was a planned meeting. The other question is the killing of Tippit. And I think Hal Weisberg always said, if Tippit hadn't been killed, he would have needed to be invented. There needed to be a way to pick him up. But the whole Tippit slaying is still a confusing thing. I don't know whether Oswald did it or not, but it's hard to imagine this is just a random event in Oak Cliff. But certainly the possibility he was meeting someone, the possibility he was reporting in is fairly great. And the most obvious explanation for why he would do that. Again, he's not trying to get away. He's not hiding. I mean,
Well, what do you feel has changed from when you were first researching this to where it's at now? Obviously, I don't think a lot of people, I didn't know if back then people believed the single bullet theory as much as I think a lot of people don't believe it now. But there's been a lot more evidence that's come out now to show that Oswald was more than just a lone assassin, 24-year-old loser type that couldn't hold down a job or mentally unstable or something like that. I think now the narrative is that he was being watched. There was surveillance on him. He was some type of intelligence asset, but we don't know which. He could have been FBI or CIA or could have switched at some point. But I think that's the narrative now. But they're still saying it was all just him, which I think we just got to get people to the level of that there was more than one. But I'm curious, in your mind, what has stayed the same and what has changed?
we always believed and knew early in the game. When Vincent, Tom, and I wrote that piece in the Midlothian Mirror, which was 50 years ago. We knew about the intelligence linkages. The critic community knew a lot of this stuff, and some of the popular books were raising these questions back then. What has changed from the early days till now is a ton more detail about every aspect of the case, from the looking at the autopsy and the people present and the coffins and all that stuff. All of that stuff happened over the intervening years. The intelligence stuff, more detail about Mexico City, there's a ton more stuff there. It's interesting, though, there are still some blank zones. And I haven't had the time to be super involved, but I've always been curious about, when you're talking about surveillance and handlers, Vladimir Boris Karapetsnitsky, which was commissioned. This was a classified document that was either leaked to me on purpose or leaked to me by accident, but where I got to look at it. I remember I had all the names in my memory of names that appear in the titles of classified documents. And I saw Vladimir Boris Karapetsnitsky, I almost passed out. And when I got that file, he was a guy that was suspected as being the older man in a bed next to him that Oswald described as having talked to him a lot when he was in the hospital in Minsk and was asking him a lot of questions. Very talkative old man. That man, Vladimir Boris Karapetsnitsky, was a permanent traveling representative of the Minerva Machinery Company, which we believe was just a front, whose passport revealed that he went back and forth across the Iron Curtain many times. And in fact, I believe at the time the Warren Commission was meeting, he was, it might have been in East Germany, but he was unavailable for the FBI to interview. And to my knowledge, he never was interviewed. So what we have is his passport file and some information about his travels. And we know that the reason he was in the hospital in Minsk was to have a prostate gland operated on, but it was a elective surgery. He was not in real trouble. Nonetheless, had traveled from New York to Berlin, both of whom, of course, have excellent health care. And if you're going to have a surgery, you might consider to travel to Minsk, to a small hospital, to have his prostate operated on. But he actually had an operation, apparently.
The detail of that.
I mean, it's mind-boggling. But when you sit there and look at that thing and say, did no one ever talk with him? Do we know nothing about him other than he's probably the old man that Oswald refers to in his journal? I mean, it's crazy. And the addictive thing about this case is that there are thousands of leads like that, all of which could be really interesting. I don't know, for example, if they've ever found who is Mohammed Reggab, Reggab. There's a document that says that if what he alleges is true, then Marina Oswald's testimony has to be totally reevaluated. It comes from the origins of the document, or I believe a U.S. consulate in Australia. So it's a very, again, the name, the location, none of that stuff makes any sense. As a young researcher, I kept encountering things like that. I said, my God, a statement like that you'd have to totally reevaluate Marina's testimony, and that one isn't run to ground. And who the hell is Mohammed Rega? I mean, and why Australia? Why does somebody in Australia know something? I mean, that's the kind of, but the sheer volume of this stuff has simply meant that there are thousands of leads to run down, and independent investigators have run down a ton of them. There's a ton that can't be run down because you need access to intelligence. Again, the thing I stumbled on in Martinsburg, Pennsylvania, you can't do that unless you're an intelligence agency. You can't find out who this guy is. You can't interrogate him to find out how come they've got Oswald's name and Ruby's name on a single piece of paper prior to the assassination. I mean, and I think that's the reality. And remember, when the Congressional Committee finished up its work early, it turned it over to the Justice Department to investigate, since they concluded there was a conspiracy. Well, needless to say, I don't know of any investigation that followed. So do I think anything's going to happen? No, I think that the reality is we'll occasionally have people's deathbed statements. Hard to know what they are. There are people who've confessed to being part of it on their deathbed. There are people that have named others. But I think it's difficult now. We're so far past the time zone when a lot of these people were all alive.
Well, we know the FBI has lied about having intelligence reports on Oswald. Do you think the purpose for their intelligence reporting, or the amount of intelligence reports that they did have that either might have been destroyed or something of that sort, do you think that was because they saw an opportunity to gather information from foreign countries? Not so much investigate or look deeper into Oswald, but kind of using it as a method of being able to go into other countries and checking their embassies and archives and material as well, too. I mean, it's a great opportunity. Never let it go to waste.
Yeah, and I don't know. The one thing I'm very clear on is that Hoover was into having a pristine image, and this was a big time problem because of all their connections. I believe that one of the realities of this thing is all of the intelligence agencies were doing bad things of all sorts, and everybody was running to cover their own asses. And one of the reasons we know some of what we know is that people were busy covering their own asses and didn't cover everybody else's ass. But you've got Office of Naval Intelligence, you've got Defense Intelligence Agency, you've got the CIA, the FBI. We don't know much about the NSA, which is, behind the scenes on so many things. You have a lot of intelligence agencies, Secret Service, all of whom had terrible failures here and or easy connection to Oswald. So everybody's running for cover. And but bigger thing, I think, is the Cold War, what you started the conversation talking about. The reality was that at the time, it wouldn't have taken much to set off a world war. Remember that one of Kennedy's big issues was there were people that wanted first strike against the Soviet Union. We had a missile advantage originally. And as they began to develop a missile program, there was a strong voice in the U.S. military wanting to hit them first. Even later, when you came up with the ABM system, that only works if you strike first. The system doesn't work with a full nuclear attack. It only works if you knock out most of their missiles before they get off the ground. So I do think that that was looming. You had you have the bombers up in the air. You have a condition where a single command can send them off bombing Russia or Cuba. You have a very volatile situation. Remember what happened. You have LBJ, some Secret Service agents, and presidential aides in Air Force One heading to DC from Dallas with the body, the evidence, whatever, and Jackie Kennedy. You have another plane halfway across the Pacific with most of the United States cabinet in a single plane, and it does not have any guard planes of any sort, just a plane. And Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State ranking cabinet officer, sent the adjutant to the safe to get the code book out because they're now in national emergency, want to encrypt, and the code book is gone. So they had to talk essentially an open channel that a ham radio operator could have linked into and listened to. So you have not only the government up in the air, but you have the government's thinking and talking through the Situation Room of the White House, all that occurring at the same time. The Joint Chiefs, of course, just happened to be meeting at the time and simply continued meeting. So what you had is a situation where someone could easily tell what the thinking is and are they buying the story. And remember that T.H. White told us in Making of a President, 1964, that, and he verified this for Tom, Vincent, and I, that on the flight home, Johnson and the Secret Service were told there was a lone assassin and he'd been caught. Now, remembering that it landed at 4:59 Dallas time, basically, in Washington. And that meant by the end of the afternoon, in effect, the president and the Secret Service had been told there was a lone assassin, no conspiracy. Now think about that for a moment. Who needs to know the absolute truth? The president and the Secret Service. They can feed bullshit to anybody else. You can't feed it to them. They got to remember, Johnson was in the motorcade. There was a concern this could have been an attempt to knock off both the president and vice president. So very serious situation as to whether Johnson was at risk, whether there's a coup or something else going on. And so what happens? Somebody tells LBJ and the Secret Service, don't worry, in effect. And as White said, so the president's mind turned to the duties of consoling the stricken and dealing with the grief. The reality was that Oswald was probably not even asked about the assassination at that point. All we know is that at about 7:29 in the evening, when he went between rooms, the press yelled, "Did you kill the president?" He looked surprised and said, "I've been asked about the killing of a police officer." So that was 2.5 hours later. Oswald hadn't even been asked about it. The first actual link to the killing was supposedly at 2 a.m. the next morning when the FBI linked the rifles delivery to Alex James Hiddell, which was an Oswald alias. So what's the lone assassin thing there? Remembering Dean Rusk asserted about a week later there was no conspiracy, and none other than Gerald Ford told him it was too early to tell. So you got to go back to that moment, which is why we wrote that series, The Watchman, Waketh, but in vain, because the reality was that that story was put out almost immediately by somebody in the power structure. What we don't know is who said what. We know a number of the players. We know who ran the phones at the Situation Room of the White House. We know a lot of things, but we don't know what those messages all were. What we know is we've got an edited transcript of some of them, and that's it. Pierre Salinger had a full copy of the tape and told Vince Salandria that he would give us access, and he authorized access, only it's gone from his personal papers to National Archives. So we were never able to actually determine who sent the message. We know CIA, we know Joint Chiefs, we know Situation Room. We don't know where the messages came from or what precisely they said and at what time. But any message that afternoon about Oswald even being involved is false because he hadn't even been asked about it.
I'm on the Oswald was innocent side, but I'm going to ask you probably what might seem like a lone nut question. It's not a lone nut like, straightforward, like there was no conspiracy. It's more like if you understand the Cold War a little bit, there's a big question of how Oswald got his money back or got money he was given from the loan department or whoever it was to come back home after trying to throw down his U.S. citizenship in the Russian embassy. Now, he paid it back in an extremely quick time, which I don't have an explanation for. I can't do that. But do you believe that he was loaned that money because of the fact that there could be this embarrassment to the U.S. government or a national security issue with him making a scene at one of these embassies, and also the suicide attempt too? I mean, you could look at it from the Russian side. If you have an American die on your soil, it's not good. No,
Well, from an accounting standpoint, by the way, it's an interesting one of Mary Farrell's friends, Arch Kimbrough, is an extremely conservative guy in Dallas who looked into this case early in the game. Arch was an accountant, and Arch pointed out that there was no evidence that Oswald had the money to go and defect. He never had more than $300 in the bank, and Arch calculated the likely cost of travel. Bear in mind, it's hard to know the exact cost in Oswald's case because there's a leg of his trip that's unaccounted for, and that's how he got to Minsk, because the stamp on his passport is such that he couldn't have flown on a commercial flight. It had to be private or military. There was no commercial flight that could have got him there to enter the Soviet Union at that point. So, but how did he have the money to defect? I think Arch came up with some number total of something like $1,600 or something. He calculated what he thought it cost to get there. So yeah, from the beginning to the end, the whole Russian thing is doesn't make sense. My belief about Oswald is this: Oswald was somebody who envisioned himself as a James Bond type. He started out life as without any good models. If you look at his psych eval when he was 17, he's intelligent but not super bright. His measured IQ at the time was 117, I believe, and which is intelligent but not super bright. Not average person in college is well above that. That he got intrigued by stuff. I believe he signed up for that CIA program that was running at the time that was getting Americans who were traveling to places like the Soviet Union to do little informal types of stuff. Only in his case, it was an actual defection where he had military information of some value. It was a major story in the Washington Post at the time. People have forgotten that. His defection is, although he wasn't a big name, his defection was quite noteworthy. And Lieutenant Donovan, his commanding officer, said they claimed they had to change a whole bunch of codes and other things once he defected. The Soviets didn't buy it for an instant. And had he not, the suicide attempt thing was a fake, but it was an attempt, but he did cut himself. It was an attempt to embarrass the Soviets. So they sort of had to take him in. They never trusted him. He never got access to anything. And, I think the reality was he was in the Soviet Union for that time period, got married, didn't have anything to show for it, came home. But I think he had been a fringe character of that sort for some time, which made him an ideal patsy. He's not super bright. He's intelligent, but not super bright, relatively easily manipulated, and easy to keep an eye on. Nothing better than
Do you believe he was a part of the U-2 defector program? Because like my train of thinking with that kind of lone nut question was when he does return, he does get interviewed, but it's by an FBI agent who I didn't know about. I thought it was just Hosty. That was the only guy that interacted with Oswald. John Fain. Now we don't know exactly what was spoken to in the 2 hours that they talked in his car, but after that you see you see small payments for the loan department, $20 or something like that, which I mean, still a lot for his salary considering he's looking for a job at this point. But then it goes to hundreds, and then he's paying it back like in three small payments, but they're huge, large sums of money. And this is after his 2 hour interview, where I'm wondering if that was the FBI informant, pitch did he become an FBI informant there? Because they were more worried about Marina, based on Oswald. They were just worried she was a swallow.
Well, you got to remember with Marina, she had to sign that she had never been a member of the Communist Party and bullshit like that. She was secretary of the Comsol Soviet Youth Organization and raised by an uncle as a colonel in KGB. I mean, it's a kind of mind-boggling couple if you think about it. Yeah, I'm sure that they were paying attention to her, and I'm sure Oswald was also someone I doubt that anybody would have trusted in terms of, you know, he's the kind of person you would expect could well have gotten caught up in Soviet view of things. I mean, could he be double or triple? Who knows? But I think the bigger thing is he came back still with this intelligence connection, maybe new ones. You could be right that that was a recruitment effort. They didn't debrief him for, what was it, a week? I mean, he didn't have to get interviewed right when he came back. They let him settle in, and then you know, the whole thing too, he'd given up his passport, and they'd never put a watch card out for his passport, despite the fact he's a publicly known security risk. Anyway,
well, there's real suspicions about, like, even with Hosty and things of that sort. Like, he writes a note to Hosty, and Hosty destroys the note after he's named in the assassination as killing the president. There's a lot of serious issues that I feel like are not controversial. They're just not in the public's view of how the assassination works. It helps, like, it's like understanding the Cold War. More people understood the Cold War, they would understand, like, that word communism getting labeled on every single thing. People just wipe their hands with it. Nope. All right, he's a communist. I don't want anything to deal with him. And then they walk away. But if you listen to all the transcripts and all the testimonies from everybody, he's not painted as a communist. He's painted as a Marxist or something of that sort who kind of reads both sides of the literature.
well, again, there was a danger if it goes beyond Oswald, because the danger is, of course, is it a Cuban conspiracy? Is it a Russian conspiracy? And of course, he's visiting with all these folks the summer before, so it's a perfect setup for somebody to use this as a reason for doing it. One thing about the Cold War, though, let me underline something. I wondered for years, how could a sworn military officer or CIA officer kill his commander in chief? What would be required? It's not just a disagreement about political things. It seemed to me there would need to be some internal rationale that it was okay in this situation. And I think that the likelihood is that the what we now know about the first strike generals, partly because that taping system in the White House existed before Nixon, and in fact, the damn thing was running when Kennedy walked out of a meeting fuming, and the first strikers were in there talking about it and talking, you know, basically saw Kennedy as a traitor. So the issue for them was he's a traitor, and that he was selling out the United States with this backdoor conversations with Khrushchev. So I think that the problem was the private connections, which had so much to do with Berlin and with eventually the missile crisis. All of that, those were viewed as straight out treason, I believe. And I believe if you get one of the rabid anti-communist people who was willing to start World War III because we'd lose millions less than they would, that's rationale. That's a justification.
It's part of the reason why I kind of I like all the mafia theories. I mean, everyone's got reasonable evidence to support their conclusions just on the basis of it's been 60 years of research and there's certain directions. They're going to uncover a lot of weird connections, and a lot was going on, probably more than we'll ever know. But everyone always brings up the question, well, who had the motive and who had the means and who gained after the assassination? I was like, well, take your pick. Everybody did. Harold Bird did. He got a famous building and showed off a sixth floor window in his house, which is just weird. Then Johnson becomes president and all this. So I kind of boiled it down to like what I think it really highlights is if you look into the government aspect, you understand what our government was running like, the climate of it, what the times were like. And it was a fraternity. It was basically a bunch of guys. And if you look at like Alan Dulles, did he perceive himself as this evil person, or did he think he had to do the hard things that nobody else will do to save the country that he loves? And if you're a problem or deemed a communist, you're now a threat to his family or his country or his patriotic duty to his country. And now that's a problem. So I just think we have a bunch of like, I wouldn't say mentally ill people in our government, but they're not stable. William Harvey's the best example of that one.
Well, I think the related thing is that the other thing that's come forward during the intervening years has been how much is known about the CIA. The CIA was relatively unknown to the public. They knew there was such a thing, knew very little about it back in the 50s, early 60s. I mean, and the reality is our involvement with the killing of Diem and all of the other assassinations. I'm reading a book on Angleton right now, and I mean it's the Dulles brothers and these guys were knocking off foreign leaders right and left. And if you look at the number of assassinations or overthrows that we played a role in, it's substantial. And that's the part of the history none of us grew up knowing about. It's the worst thing we read was the ugly American, but nothing at this level of government stuff. And I think when you realize that, the people we're talking about are party to a long line of killing leaders. And killing leaders over the fact that they were neutrals at times, not because they were communists, because they weren't taking a strong enough anti-communist stand. When you look at all that, then your thesis is gold, because in that context, this is not that unusual. The only thing unusual was it happened to be our president.
That's the disconnect I don't understand is why can't people get there if we can talk about, like, if you mention to someone foreign plots to kill foreign leaders or something like that from our government, they'll go, oh yeah, I believe that our government's horrible. But then you go, they killed our president. They go, there's no way, that's a conspiracy theory. I'm like, it's the same methods, maybe different time, different place, but I guess it's the first time it's happened on domestic soil. I mean, we know about assassinations or attempt assassinations like the Reagan one, but the president being killed in broad daylight in front of a bunch of people in Dealey Plaza, I guess there's just a disconnect. Like, it's such a horrific tragedy. It's kind of like 9/11. If you just have like, maybe we weren't given the full truth or something like that, whether it was pre-knowledge or anything of that sort, you get people just rolling their eyes and saying that's a conspiracy subject. I'm like, well, I think every government's up to their own nefarious stuff.
Well, you may remember when the Warren Commission started meeting, Alan Dulles said that these are always one-man jobs and gave a booklet that the CIA had prepared for the commission to prove that. And I don't know who was, John Sherman Cooper or Rich Russell said, well, what about Lincoln? And Dulles's response was, well, it was mostly one man. They hung a bunch of people for it, of course. Yeah, it was a conspiracy, and the real question, unanswered even today, was who was in on it completely. We got the part of the operations, and plus some innocent people got hung, like Ruth Paine probably, but not Ruth Paine. Who? Yeah, it was. No, what was her first? The woman who owned the boarding house in Lincoln.
Ooh, I don't know that one.
I can't remember.
I know who you're talking about, but she's a mysterious death.
Right. And they killed well, Samuel Mudd was sent to Devil's Island. He was one of the few that didn't get hung. He's the guy who set Booth's leg, having absolutely no idea he was Booth. or that there'd been an assassination. Those were long before. Those were days when people got their information from newspapers. But the point is that Lincoln was a conspiracy, and in fact, they were going to try to kill several other leaders. And there was a question about, in the cabinet, was Secretary of War Seward involved? I mean, there were unanswered questions even today about Lincoln. But you're right. Most of them have been some kind of lone nut or lone person with a cause.
Why wouldn't they just add another patsy on top of Oswald to say that there was two shooters or there was this?
Well, couple of reasons. And Vince Salandria, by the way, believed that the story actually had some backup, that you would, he called it the 1, 2, 3 assassin dance. He said that if in fact the central story doesn't fly, and it shouldn't have flown and it shouldn't have come close to flying, that there would be a backup of a couple of anti-Castro Cubans or small thing. And in fact, I was in fact thinking that the kind of thing Vince was positing was stuff like the Clay Shaw type thing, where you have some little gathering that's not really making the thing happen, but which looks bad, or you can pull some other people in and prosecute them for some kind of involvement, but that you wouldn't ever have a sophisticated high level thing. As soon as you have that, and I think that's the problem here, if you're talking about a gunman in the front getting away and things like that, it's a more complicated story. There were, we have witnesses to 2 men on the 6th floor with weapons.
Black rim glasses, right?
Well, the one I remember was a short, thick-set guy with a dark brown suit and a white shirt who had a weapon that was not a rifle, but was not a pistol. It was something different than it wasn't a weapon that the person readily identified. And that was on actually the opposite side of that floor, the window at the other end. And then there was a person, medium height, medium build, short sleeve white sports shirt with a collar, with a rifle that was believed to be a Secret Service agent, or at least at the time, the thinking maybe they have people in high buildings. But so I think you've got the possibility, and that there was a short, thick-set guy who was seen leaving the building, and was picked up by that rambler in front. And who knows? I mean, that could be all coincidental, but certainly 2 different people of different build and different weapons were seen on the 6th floor. But
do you believe the Rambler story?
Well, I know Roger Craig.
It's like him and like 5 other people that did that. It actually made me come across not only the Knoll agent or the Secret Service agent on the Knoll, but there was a blood spot in Dealey Plaza. I don't know if you've ever heard that before, but I've seen statements from people talking about how there's literally a picture of a guy looking down at a giant blood stain in Dealey Plaza. Apparently someone else was rushed to Parkland Hospital with a bullet wound from Dealey Plaza.
That I don't know. I know there up at the intersection there was a what appeared to be a epileptic fit, and then James Tegg was down near the underpass. And he had a wound, but he didn't go to the hospital, I don't believe. I think he just I don't. Right. If he did, I don't remember.
And a cop had came by and saw a blood mark on his chin and asked, yeah. And he stated that that wasn't from the curb. It was from he cut himself shaving but the curb hit him in the cheek, and that's where you get the blood speckles that were on his cheek. But the cop just took this as that was a bullet fragment that hit the curb and hit him in the chin, which, I mean, that's when it comes to media reporting. That's why there's such an influence of stories. I'm surprised because I know certain articles obviously were doubling down on the official narrative. You brought this up in the beginning about the 60th anniversary and the probably some things going with the official narrative on things and not going into conspiracy. But back then they went into conspiracy stuff as well too. The government was pretty concerned about that.
Well, there was a big concern about the Tague hit because it was a shot they couldn't account for. It gave you an extra shot because you had Kennedy hit in the head, you had Conley hit, you had Kennedy hit. So before the single bullet theory, that would have been 4 bullets.
I meant you had authors like Edward Epstein, and then you had Harold Weisberg stuff. I mean, people were writing articles about these people that were having dissent, which I that never gets talked about. Whenever you talk about media during the Kennedy assassination, everyone goes, the media was 100% captured. I was like, there were some reporting going on in articles and magazines, and it caused the government to freak out a little bit, where we have Hoover mentioning things like the public must be satisfied that there was a lone assassin.
Well, there were some independent things going on. Ed Epstein's thing was a dissertation that got published. He was and I were at Cornell. In fact, we got interested in the case sitting in the very same audience listening to Mark Lane. I didn't know Ed at Cornell, but he was his advisor, Andrew Hacker, was the one who set up Lane's talk. And he was having trouble finding a thesis topic, and Hacker said maybe something connected with this. And Vince Salandria provided him with a whole lot of the autopsy stuff, and he made the book out of that. Weisberg's books didn't get much visibility, but they were out there. Obviously, Rush to Judgment is the thing that really blew things off. There were some other early books. Who Killed Kennedy by Buchanan, Joachim Houston, German, wrote a book, and there was a great book by what was his name? It was a French reporter that was very interesting, but these things didn't get a lot of visibility. And Rush to Judgment, Mark had to go around the world practically. Finally found a publisher arranged it in England, actually, and then got picked up here. But it was very hard to get Rush to Judgment published, although it had a foreword by Hugh Trevor Roper, the Regius Professor of History at Oxford. I mean, it had some big names associated. Bertrand Russell, a strong supporter of the book. I mean, so you had some international figures, but there was a lot more discussion of the case going on in Europe. Paris Match had a series of articles. There were some pretty interesting things that got published in Europe, not here. But I will tell you that when Mark Lane, who, remember, was supposed to be Oswald's defense counsel, at least picked by his mom, so certainly had some visibility potentially, but Mark said he could not get on a radio or TV program in the United States originally. The first few years, it was literally not possible. He did some Canadian programs, and Canada did a kind of voice, northern United States could get broadcast in. But other than that, Mark was doing college campus and coffee house type stuff. And I don't know if, I did a series for the Minneapolis Star Tribune in the op-ed page that ran for a week. That was the first time someone critical of the Warren Commission, who was not a journalist, had ever been published. And the Star Tribune was scarcely a huge newspaper, but it was at least a nationally known newspaper. That was the only time anybody had published. There were a few reporters, Richard Dudman, St. Louis St. Louis Post-Dispatch. There were a few reporters who did critical pieces, but mostly, and the Pulitzer Prize went to Hugh Ainsworth, mostly it was pro-commission stuff, pro-lone assassin stuff. And the way I got to write my thing, by the way, was very interesting. they published this Hugh Ainsworth piece in the Star Tribune, and I wrote a critical letter to the editor taking it apart. And to their credit, the editor of the editorial pages called me up and said, they were very interested. Would I consider doing a piece? And they gave me 5-part op-ed. It was Monday through Friday, 5 articles. So there were people in journalism that had a concern or an interest. I mean, I was struck by that. I'm literally a nobody. I was a graduate student in clinical psych. Nobody ever heard of. So,
Who would you say were the biggest cement blocks of the media to the Warren Commission, like Dan Rather, Walter Cronkite, names like that obviously had more media power?
Rather was key later in the game when the CBS did their piece, and I did some work with Robert Richter, the associate producer, just in exchange for the promise that they were going to be honest, and got the call near the end, as did Tink Thompson, that, we got to come out for the commission. We said, well, you know it's false. How can you do this? Your own testing of the rifle and stuff, you know it's false. And he just said, well, the higher-ups have decided. And he said, I'm really sorry. I know I promised honesty, but if I expose this, I'm finished. I'll have no work anywhere. I'd be finished in journalism at the end of my career. He said, I'm a young father. I got kids. I can't do it. But he actually acknowledged that it was and the higher ups thing, I had that experience here in Alexandria, Minnesota, a small TV station where they were hostile, but let me do my piece. The end of the thing, people came up and said, my God, I can't believe this has happened in America. And I got all this stuff. The station manager was there. And they said, we'll have to have you back to do a real piece on this. This is vital and stuff. Okay. I was to learn 2 days later that the piece never aired. I figured there something screwed up, but I thought I was owed an explanation. I'd given up dinner, traveled a long distance to give this interview. The guy said, well, he said it was too controversial, and higher ups sort of said we couldn't do it. I said, the higher ups, do you remember 2 days ago when you asked how any self-respecting American journalist could not tell this story and how it's boggled your mind? I said, well, you now know something about the case I do not know. You know who the higher ups are. Who are they? You're a small, I hate to say this, fella, but you're a small station in Alexandria, Minnesota that you only know about if you know about the Kensington runestone. I mean, it's even people in Minnesota barely know what Alexandria is. And that's too controversial to discuss the death of an American president a decade after it happens. To discuss it. I mean, you see, what I did, what we put up on the screen is I used only kind of FBI reports. I used documents. I used really the side-by-side 2 versions of Life magazine where they altered what they showed. Again, this guy 2 days earlier, the transformation, what is it? Well, I think the press is about your own personal safety in terms of your job, your career, your ability to earn a living, the here and now of your life. And the anti-communism or any of that stuff works because it gets to a point where you become convinced it's you that they're after. That's the kicker. Same with Trump. The whole thing there is he gets his followers to believe that they are the ones in harm's way. Attack on him is attack on them. Those same people are waiting right around the corner. And that's what works. Fear always works. And I might add, family duties, where you have to weigh what's at stake.
Would you take it back all these years later? Would you take back the amount of time you researched into this, into something else? You could have studied birds or anything of that sort and been an expert at that. Bowling.
Well, I was studying birds when it started. I was in wildlife management. originally. No, I wouldn't. And actually, I regret the fact that I couldn't do more. I can be easily lured back. All it takes is somebody in the Weisberg archives finds something about me, contacts me, and I'm back in it again and thinking, oh, geez, I never did that one interview. I couldn't track her down. And this case, there are pieces that we could actually figure out and learn. I mean, that's the other attraction. This isn't a total blank slate. We've been able to write quite a bit on it. It's just we don't have all the final pieces. We've got a whole bunch of pieces there, but it's like we got about 14 chessboards and we haven't put all the pieces on, and we're not sure we're getting them on the right board. It's an enigma wrapped in a conundrum. But no, I wouldn't. I regret not having had time to go further. And I did get scared off a bit by the death of the person who was investigating me. That did rattle me. And again,
The death of the person that was investigating you?
yeah, this is in our research unit. A guy showed up. We had somebody left. We were needing another staff member quick because of the ongoing experiments we were doing. And a guy came in with pretty good credentials, letters of reference and stuff. He started attending all of my talks on the JFK case. And then late one night, one of the other researchers came in unexpectedly and saw the guy going through my desk at night, like at 2 a.m. And the friends kept silent, so he didn't realize he'd been observed. By this time, we already had people were feeling he was some kind of agent or something. And there was something about him that was very strange. And he was asking a lot of questions about my JFK work of the secretaries and other people, enough so people noted it. And he was someone who really, however, had made some comments about Kennedy. He was felt very positively about John Kennedy. So we thought, well, maybe we're getting a little paranoid until he went through my desk. So what happened is the next night at 2 a.m., we took his desk apart from the back, got into the locked drawer, got his resume out. This was not the resume we'd seen. And saw U.S. Army intelligence, top secret security clearance, and other stuff on his resume. And also saw he'd been in Dallas and that he'd also been, anyway, there was enough on it that was suspicious. It was relatively clear that what had been presented to us was fake. We also had begun to realize he wasn't a psychophysiological researcher. That was phony. And we discovered that because the guy wasn't competent. He was a willing worker, but he didn't know this whole area of work. We were doing work on what became the lie detector, essentially. Well, finally, I decided when he was asking about how I was going to go to New Orleans, the route I was taking and stuff like that, I got kind of weirded out. And I said, okay. So I met with him privately. His name was Jim Murray. I said, Jim, look, you profess to care about John Kennedy. We know you're fake. We know you're some kind of agent of some sort. We thought you were a narc because we were doing all this research with psychedelics and stuff. But we could see U.S. Army intelligence. I just told him we went through my desk, so we got yours. And I said, so we know, and I'm not expecting you to confirm any of that, but I just, to be clear, also, to be honest, I've been weirded out by your trying to find out the means of I'm going to go to New Orleans to take this stuff to Garrison and stuff. And I just said, look, for what it's worth, there are a lot of fine people that are serving this country in various capacities who become part of something inadvertently. But I said, people that are messing with this right now in your line of work are accessories after the fact and are part of what happened and what's should be happening now and isn't happening, namely cleaning up. And he looked troubled. And I should tell you, he also had a thing about dating girls who were close to underage, and we'd been giving him advice on relationships. I mean, he'd sort of come to like us and come to us and trying to help him out. He was much older than, I mean, he was like in his, well, at that time we were in our 20s, he's late 30s, and big military type guy, just anyway. And he said, well, I've been troubled about this, and you're right. I have been attending, and I've been very curious, and and he said, I'd like to help. I really can't, but just so you know, my heart is there. And you're right. And he said, is there a way I can securely communicate with you that no one would know? We'd set up a mail drop. And he said, I'm going to send you something, for God's sake, trusting that no one will learn we had this conversation. So I'm not going to even tell you what it is. But the thing that he was focused on, we were in our discussion, the thing I threw out, knowing it was Army intelligence and he'd been in the Texas area, was the James W. Powell, who had been caught inside the depository and had taken photos, although we don't know of what, after the assassination. Now, supposedly the depository was sealed off, which we know it wasn't complete. But Powell was a guy they dragged in who didn't work there. They didn't say where they found him in the building, but he was taken for questioning. That's how we know who he is. Never questioned by anybody. Now, if you have an actual, now later, he was questioned. He was on duty that day. Nobody asked, what was your duty? He didn't just happen to be in front of the depository in the crowd. He didn't just happen to be there. He said he was on duty. Doing what? Why was he in the book depository building? Why was he at that spot? No one asked that. That's the kind of thing that Hicks committee never got to. But it was, the only reaction in our conversation was to the Powell. So I wondered. And, again, I wasn't going to try to engage him in conversation. I'm not a interrogator, clinical psych grad student, way out of his depth. But what happened was that I had a week off after that conversation, and I came back to the office. I said, where's Jim? They said, he's gone. I said, he's gone. They said, yeah, he started getting a bunch of phone calls, and he was never around at the time. This is, again, long before cell phones and stuff, so it wasn't always easy to catch people. And we got, finally, I took a message from some guy in Alaska, and he had some instructions about taking a plane there or something. So he resigned his position here, and I guess subletted his apartment. He was racing around doing all this stuff while you were gone. So, wow. That's wild. Well, next thing that happened is I got a phone call from a man claiming to be a police officer in Anchorage, Alaska, saying that Murray was dead. He'd been shot to death. It turned out that eventually there were different versions. They all were accidental shooting. They were out in some godforsaken part of Alaska and way far away from hospitals and stuff, and had helicoptered in. And one version was that a rifle had dropped and hit and discharged. In any event,
Don't ever go to Alaska. That's what you just don't do. If anybody ever invites you.
I thought this was really bizarre, but here's what I found. First of all, Murray was a geologist by training, and that was on his resume. It was clear as a geologist, had been to a bunch of places. Next thing he, the man who called him, oh, they hadn't taken the trash out yet. So we emptied the trash cans and we found her crumpled up note that she had taken, that he had seen and thrown in the trash. Mr. McGregor of McGregor Joint Venture, it told him what flight to take. There'd be a thing at the airport for him. He was to go to, I think, a Hilton hotel and then check in as Mr. Smith or ask for Mr. Smith. That was on this little piece of paper. And I later verified that he really had been shot. In fact, they had a memorial service for him at the campus. I talked to the police chief up there, and they had called me because my name and phone number was found on his body. That's how come I got the call. And he verified he was deceased, and there was an obituary. We tracked down his parents had died. His uncle raised him in Corcoran, California. I remembered it because it's at the center of the state. It's a place I'd never heard of. We tracked his uncle down and verified that Jim had been shot to death. And so if this was a fake job and he was going for reassignment, it was pretty well done. There were a lot of people involved. His uncle in Corcoran, California, the Episcopal Society people here. And a friend was going to Alaska and was going to try to look into the death, but either didn't or didn't get back to me. I never heard back. And again, I'm a graduate student in clinical psych. I can't track these things down, but it really troubled me. It was hard to believe, but and when I told my roommates, my office mates and stuff, everybody's mind was kind of blown by this thing. But he's dead. I never got anything. Who knows if there was anything to it? But there's no doubt. We did, by the way, also check at the VA and found out that the people who had written the letters of reference were doing it as favors to people. They didn't actually know the guy. And they certainly didn't know they were recommending a military officer who was a intelligence guy and who's trained as a geologist into a sensitive research like we were doing. But that was too close to home. That was, at that point, I just said to myself, man, this has gotten serious.
I'm just asking for a throat chop. That's all I want. Jeez.
Well, even the going to see Garrison and the next day, all the stuff I took is gone from his safe. I'm thinking, oh my God, didn't last 24 hours in the friggin' office. And, it also the enormity of the thing just hit me that it's fairly hard to have an impact on something at that level. But I think the real kicker was it got very serious with Jim Murray's demise. That was, for me, kind of a final straw. I also, David Croman, who's now deceased, had also threatened me at one point in front of, actually a witness heard him, told me that if I kept doing this kind of stuff, after it was right after Bobby Kennedy was shot, and he just said, well, he said, he's meddling with things. And I said to my friend, at the time I'd been going in to save a guy in a park who was being beaten, and I got beaten badly myself. I was blind in one eye and sort of still recovering, pretty vulnerable when, and so I had this gal was driving me around, and I said, do you think he threatened me? She said, I think he threatened your life. I said, okay, well, I know I'm a little out of it right now, but it did seem to be something that was troubling. That happened. All of that stuff happened within a period of time, and I just thought, This is
Appreciate your commitment for the case, especially, joining me again to, talk about it as well too. As a younger generation, I appreciate it. That's all I can say. I can't speak for my whole generation. Hopefully we can get the younger kids in it, but they're
well, the
obsessed with
heartening
that.
thing is people like yourself and how many people have rediscovered this and really are finding out more things in more detail. I don't know if we'll ever be able to prove who did it, but it's been great to watch. I'm fascinated by how much has been discovered since I was active in the case. I mean, also fascinated that there are some things that were blocks back then that still are things we can't answer. I would have thought by now, if they could be run to ground, they've been run to ground, but citizens can only do so much.
Well, Gary, is there a place where people can find any of your links, or is it still the same ones from the last couple times we've chatted?
It's the same, yeah. And that some of this stuff is up on various websites as people have discovered. I think my piece on the deaths, legacy of fear, is up on the internet.
I'll link it all in the description. People will be able to click. Gary, it's been a pleasure chatting with you again, and thanks everybody for listening to this episode of